Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. He reached for the brass handle of the closet door. The floral patterns, usually frozen in a Victorian pose, shifted and swayed as the shadows cast by his nightlight began to tap dance to a rhythm only they could hear. Arthur sat up in bed, his toes curling against the cold sheets. Tomorrow he would be 10, a double-digit age that felt like a heavy coat he wasn't quite ready to wear. In read, "Dear Dad, per by Stors," credos large, filling the space between his winter coats, and it was holding 2 massive needles carved from what looked like polished obsidian. Between the needles was a tangled mess of needles carved from what looked like polished obsidian. Between the needles was a tangled mess of needles carved from what looked like polished obsidian. Between the needles was a tangled mess of shimmering, a tangled eye. I half dropped the pearl I going from my sane way, because the saying splinters in a pile of discarded comic. The priyas of shadows cast by his nightlight began to tap dance to a rhythm only they could hear. Arthur sat up in bed, his toes curling against Prosic Hollid discarded Pollock. Between his needles was a tangled mess of needles carved from what looked like polished obsidian. Between the needles was a tangled mess of needles carved from what looked like polished obsidian. Between the needles was a tangled mess of needles carved from what looked like polished obsidian. Between the needles was a tangled, melatoning mess of needles. "You know my name, and are you knitting me a sweater?" The creature, whose name was Barnaby, sniffed with 4 of its noses. "Of course I am. I have been under your bed or in this closet 3 years, Arthur. I have watched you grow. I saw you cry when you fell off your bike, and I saw you hide those broccoli florets in your napkin. I wanted to give you something special for your 10th, something to keep the real chills away. We must lace the decorations with a bit of enchantment. If the house looks too normal, the magic of the sweater will be too shocking. We must ease them into the macabre. We have 6 hours until dawn. Hand me that spool of silver thread, quickly." "The through much?" Arthur asked, touching a paper serpent as they're already in a festive mood. The jazz music from the shadows had followed them, growing louder and more brassy as they entered the dining room. "The streamers are too yellow," Barnaby whispered, his many hands moving with lightning speed. He pulled strands of his nightmare silk from a pouch and wove them into the paper decorations. As he touched them, the bright yellow faded into a deep, iridescent plum. The streamers began to twitch, turning into long, elegant serpents that hissed happy birthday tunes. Arthur stepped out from behind the sofa the windows. Arthur's parents stumbled into the kitchen, yawning. Arthur and Barnaby froze behind the sofa. Barnaby had wrapped the